Hello and welcome back to a new Kerbal Space Program video with Spaceship. So today we're going to take a look at the new SSTO in our SSTO fleet. And this SSTO, as you probably have seen from the thumbnail or the title, we're going to Duna. And frankly speaking, this is my first SSTO that went to Duna. So there are a lot of interesting things if you're as well interested in building SSTOs to Duna and beyond or something like that for you as well, so you might actually be able to get away something. And in this video I'm actually going to talk more about the footage than I have talked about the SSTO footage in previous videos, so it's not really a guide, but still a tiny bit of guide content will be here, or is here. So starting off with the first ascent that already passed, or the first stage of the ascent, because the thrust-weight ratio of those Rapier engines is not quite enough, and even with the single Whiplash engine included, not quite enough to accelerate us in a slight shallow climb to above 400 meters per second. We were skimming along the water's surface to pick up some speed, and once we were around 450 meters per second, we or I at least, pulled up towards my more or less regular climb with SSTOs of between 15 and 20 degrees until we're around 20 kilometers up. Then we, and 1200 meters per second of speed, then we engage the nuclear engines and continue up into space. Everything else pretty much normal. So after we've reached space here, as you can see in this short little intermediate clip, just deploying the solar panels and having a nice panoramic screenshot. So waiting for a nice transfer window and engaging our doing some maneuver notes in between these two cuts, so you haven't really missed a lot of interesting footage. But I decided to show this transfer burn here because this also shows a bit my mentality in the beginning, especially, but generally speaking, the mentality with the space SSTO, space shuttle mode SSTO. I'm doing the transfer burn here in multiple burns. I think that there will be actually 4 burns in total, so we just completed the second one, and that is to make the burns more effective and to burn as close to periapsis as possible, so that the velocity marker is more or less coinciding with the vector we are trying to leave the sphere of influence of Kuban. We also got a nice encounter with Duna, slightly further along the road. I think there was actually one tiny mid-course correction necessary, but this was mainly to just get the encounter really close and fully aero braking. So like I said, we're really trying to go a rather efficient route with this SSTO, so we're going to use aero brakes, okay, and obviously aero capture at the Duna system. Jumping forward, you can see here our beautiful approach towards Duna and Ike, flying right between those two and going down into the atmosphere. Actually, I thought the atmosphere would only start at 40 kilometers, but it was already starting at 50. Not really a huge difference there. And the aero capture periapsis I went with is very low actually, but it was pretty much sufficient, or let's say it was rather, I was a bit surprised. We had no heating issues at all whatsoever, so that really shows how thin the atmosphere of Duna is. But speaking of a thin atmosphere, trust me, the thin atmosphere really helped with re-entry, so you had with entry and deceleration in terms of from orbital, aka escape velocity, was rather helpful. But later down the road you'll actually see a bunch of issues arising because of that atmosphere, but more to that once we get towards the landing zone. So after the initial aero captures, there was one more aero braking pass that I will not show. Just fiddling a bit around with the maneuver here to get you an idea that was actually consciously trying to land on the daylight side, otherwise I would have just kept the orbit the way it is. So that way we would have gone down in the dark, and that's not really nice if you're trying to make YouTube videos, since YouTube makes everything a lot darker. So more or less 1.5 orbits further down the road, you can see us here flying very low, very close to the surface, and this was a very stunning time here, because we were still very fast at 500 meters per second, skimming just above the surface. Well, it's not just above the surface, but close enough to see some surface features, terrain, and all sorts of other interesting features down there. And frankly speaking, this is I have never done an SSTO, but a space plane to Duna, but this was quite a while ago. Here, just before landing, air quick save. And well, speaking of landing, trying to land here a couple of times all ended more or less the same way. So I decided to revert a bit further back and try to land in the canyon to our right during our flyby here. And the reason is, well, the low atmosphere, and we were there actually at a rather elevated position, 3 kilometers above sea level. And well, like I said, because of the thin atmosphere, all the wing surfaces really are struggling to gain any lift, and we are very heavily reliant on the RCS to keep the nose up, just because it wants to dip down because of the lack of lift. So we crashed again, but then I thought, let's try a totally different approach, and that's the landing it like it was a rocket. Well, more or less the same approach as when you're trying to land on a body without any atmosphere, engines down, so kind of backward, and then in the very end, as you can see here, we just slightly above the surface, and then we're going to touch down, well, flip down and touch down with our wheels, because, well, I got a couple of attempts where we actually touched down in one piece, and this was not, kind of nothing blew apart, but the issue was the slopey terrain there, and once we kind of jumped up from the surface again and came back down a second time, and then we had not enough lift to control our descent, and we were either heading down with the nose first or hitting the engines, or just generally. Well, I think it is possible to land this vehicle, this specific vehicle, even as a plane, but let's say this was the easier way of doing things. So for the future, and for maybe one of your designs, having some more aerodynamic wing surfaces would really help in landing this craft on Eve, but you shouldn't go overboard with them, otherwise you might have some issues in Kerbin, well, because of your center of lift being too far forwards. Your landing, once you're completely empty, since we have some fuel left, as you can see in the upper right corner and in the left side, with the all engines showing there. But speaking of fuel, if you may pay attention to the fuel level, actually, after we skip here one day, nice beautiful scenery, you will be seeing the jump cut to the ascent, and we have less fuel. And that's because I was so conservative with the entire landing and transfer process here, that we actually had too much fuel for the nuclear engines to lift off the surface of Duna. So that's why I drained the entire fuel. Not the entire, but just some amount of liquid fuel, so that we have on takeoff a pretty much 0.9 thrust to weight ratio only with the nerves. Then after we launched with the last bit of oxidizer from the Rapier engines, we would lose enough weight to be able to do the ascent as was planned with the nuclear engines, and our thrust weight ratio would hit something along 1 point something. So, and I must admit, yeah, I was slightly frustrated in the beginning. I was actually very close to cancelling the entire mission and being like, okay, well, more engines. So speaking of more engines, I would either suggest you reducing the fuel capacity of this thing, which would make it easier to fly and of course easier to get here in the first place, but maybe you would run short on fuel, or on the other hand add another batch of engines. That this would be including Rapiers and nuclear, since we have some issues in the takeoff. So after a normal transfer from Duna back, since we, after draining that excess mass, had enough capabilities and enough fuel still to do regular just home and transfer back to Kerbin, we went again because we didn't have quite enough fuel to do an entire capture only using engines. But why should we, since we're actually a space plane, aka SSTO here? We can use the atmosphere of Kerbin again as one of our big advantages. Going for an aero braking pass at, what was it, 51 kilometers, I think. Got us really nice and easy captured. 3 or 4 aero braking turns later, we went down for our final approach, and because of the inclination of the orbit, I decided, well, it was easier for the orbital pass to go for the desert runway instead of the regular KSC runway. Well, frankly speaking, there's no real difference in those two runways, and I felt like landing at the desert runway once. So after going through the re-entry, and by the way, I'm really proud how stable this craft is, even without any fuel. Frankly speaking, I had actually more issues designing the beginning, kind of getting this craft off fully fueled from Cuban rather than flying it back empty, since I actually designed this space plane primarily around the fuselage being almost or completely emptied of all the fuel, since my previous two Mark III SSTOs, which kind of fall into the same category as this one here, had some minor stability issues. They were perfectly fine, they were really easy to fly up into space, but getting down from space was, let's say, you did some unintentional flipping at the 30-kilometer mark on re-entry. They were stable enough to regain control once we were lower down in the atmosphere, but this craft has perfect stability throughout the entire atmosphere, be that in fully fueled condition or completely empty condition, since we've got a couple 200 units of fuel here left at the final approach towards the desert runway. And the other reason, well, the desert runway is somewhere where I haven't been for quite some time actually, so we can appreciate the nice scenery here. Well, not really that much to see, but there are some wind turbines on the right side, there are some buildings on the left side, so it's really interesting to land here as kind of for a change of scenery, right? So in this note, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you were able to take away something from this SSTO design, and until next time, Spaceship signing out.